What if the most powerful people in God's kingdom aren't the ones on stage or in charge, the ones everybody sees, but the ones that nobody ever even notices? That's the question Jesus raises in this quiet, kind of overlooked moment in Matthew 18, 1 to 10. What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putoff, and this is scene 17 of the JesusX30 challenge. We're following my 3-volume book project called Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 volumes are out. Check them out wherever you buy your books, in ebook and in print. Go ahead and grab your copies and follow along. Get a lot more depth reading along and following these episodes as well. So after months of miracles and confrontations, Jesus brings the disciples back to Capernaum to regroup. And we've noticed this is a pattern for Jesus. He goes out, establishes himself, goes on a mission, sends his disciples on a mission, and then he brings them back together and they regroup and they re-strategize for what's next. Well, they're back in Capernaum. Remember, this is his home base. He established it months ago at the beginning of his public campaign. So the crowds have started to thin. Some of the noise has faded. At least some of the initial newness of his movement has begun to wear off. And now comes what I would say is the hardest part of his mission yet. This is kind of reforming the disciples' mindset. So the disciples, of course, they still think like everyone else does. They ask Jesus straight up, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Matthew 18:1. And this is such a human question, right? They've seen Jesus transfigured. They've walked behind him through cheering crowds. They've watched power flow through his hands. They've watched him heal people using the tassels, the tzitzit, hanging off of his garments, right? They've seen the miracles. They've seen the power. They've seen him go to battle against the sea 2 times now and defeat it. So they can see success is brewing. And just like I think you and me, they want to know where they rank in Jesus's hierarchy. Who's winning? Who matters most? Who doesn't matter? And Jesus doesn't answer them with a lecture. He doesn't answer them with a parable like he often does. But what he does instead is he calls a child over to him in front of everyone. And he stands the child right there in the middle of everyone. And at this point, I think everybody in the vicinity would have stopped and stared. This would have been a really dramatic moment. So in the first century, children didn't have status. They couldn't own property. They couldn't give testimony in court. They couldn't claim protection under most laws. Yeah, they were loved. Parents loved their kids, and society loved children just like we do today. But in terms of having power and social status, they didn't have any of that. And so Jesus brings this child in front of everyone after being asked who's the greatest in the kingdom, right? It's in response to that, in answer to that. And he says this, he says, truly I tell you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 18:3. Okay. So he's not being sentimental here. He's not being sweet, precious moments type Jesus character. The Greek here that Matthew uses for turn means to change direction completely. Okay. The direction that you're heading in right now, stop, turn around, and take the opposite direction. A complete 180 turn in your life. Reorient your life completely and utterly from where it's heading right now. So Jesus is telling them, stop climbing the ladder. Turn around. Stop trying to be somebody in my kingdom, because that's not how you get to be somebody in my kingdom. Greatness in my kingdom begins where your status and your pursuit of worldly recognition ends. So then he adds, and this is a really powerful scene. We could go on forever about it. But he adds, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest. Verse 4. So the word humble here, it's not about having a low self-esteem, which is, I think, a really common way to understand humility in the conservative evangelical world and in shame culture that a lot of us came out of, that was really launched in the 70s and 80s. and passed on for those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, where humility is talking down about yourself because you're a sinner and you're unworthy of God's goodness. And that's not what Jesus is saying here. This isn't about low self esteem. This isn't about talking to yourself and having negative self thoughts. This is about groundedness. Okay. This is the posture of someone who is secure enough not to perform. Catch the difference in what Jesus means by humility here versus a lot of the mythical and core understandings of humility that we hear about. So we might call this something like ego resilience. This is this type of freedom that comes when your worth isn't tied to comparison or applause. Jesus is teaching emotional and spiritual maturity long before these types of like positive psychology and contemporary mindset types of movements came along. Live this way, you don't have to shrink and beat yourself down. You just have to stop pretending to be larger than you are. Embrace life the way a child embraces life. A child is just out living. A child isn't trying to climb a ladder of success the way we do as adults, and the way we think we have to earn our place in society as adults. The next thing Jesus says is really important too. Jesus he expands on his point, and he goes on in verse 5 to say, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Okay? So he's not shifting topics here. He's explaining what this greatness looks like in action. To welcome means to make space for, to notice, to include, to honor the one society overlooks. So this is a tough concept in our world. That might mean a coworker that nobody listens to, or a friend who rarely gets invited, the person who feels invisible in church, right? Jesus says when you create belonging for them, you're not just being a nice person. You're actually receiving them, and in the process, you're receiving me. And he'll expand even more and even more sharply on that idea in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. But here, he prefaces that idea. When you receive a little child, you're receiving me. And then comes a pretty stark warning. And he says, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be greater for them to have a great millstone fastened around their neck and be drowned in the depth of the sea. Verse 6. Okay, that's graphic. Jesus is not trying to be violent and vicious. He's pointing out the urgency, the dire consequences of breaking down barriers and receiving those that society says are supposed to be left outside. And he's saying that spiritual harm, physical harm, abuse of trust, manipulation of the vulnerable, pressing down on people who can't defend themselves, that strikes at the very core of justice in the eyes of God. And the kingdom he's building, in fact, protects the powerless with fierce compassion in a way that the world still doesn't, even in our day. And he says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, and catch this, that their angels in heaven always behold the face of my Father. That's Matthew 18:10. Okay? I'm going to read that again. This is one of the most mind-blowing verses in all of the Bible that I've come across. Okay, so Jesus is talking to this crowd. He's got the child in front of him, and he says this, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always behold the face of my Father. So the phrase, behold the face of my Father, that comes from Jewish angelology, or the ideas and beliefs in ancient times about angels, okay, where a certain type of angels, and only a very specific type of angels in this whole angelic hierarchy where there's all types of angels, all types of divine beings circulating in heaven, and there's God on his throne. So there's only one type of angel in all of ancient understandings of angels that is powerful enough and privileged enough to stare at the face of God without being completely incinerated, without being destroyed. And that's an angel called the Malakei Panim, the angels of the face, literally is their name. They're the highest beings in God's court. They stand in the direct sight of God's face, in his presence, the holiest proximity in all of heaven possible. So think about what Jesus is saying here. Okay? He's saying that the most exalted beings in all of heaven are assigned to those with the lowest status on earth. Heaven's hierarchy is the exact opposite of ours. The most powerful angels in all of the heaven and earth, they're the ones who are assigned to, who belong to those who are lowest on earth. The closer you are to humility, the nearer you are to glory in heaven. It's a powerful, powerful phrase, and it's a remarkably sharp warning against harming those who can't defend themselves, both in Jesus's day and in ours. If you are struggling with feeling unseen or undervalued, I think this verse is speaking to you. Jesus is saying you're not overlooked in heaven's economy. The same divine attention, the same powerful beings who gaze upon the face of God day and night, they're the beings that God has assigned to be focused on you, the vulnerable, the weary, the childlike in spirit. When you feel invisible in this world, when your SNAP benefits are being taken from you by powerful politicians who don't feel the consequences of their decisions, when you're being mistreated, maybe by a family member, maybe by a spouse, maybe by someone at your job, maybe by someone at school, when you're being looked down upon and you just feel like nobody sees you, nobody recognizes you, I want you to remember that there are angels whose entire vocation, their entire reason for existing is to see you. And those are the angels who are the most powerful, the most protective, the most vicious, and the most glorious creatures aside from God himself in the heavenly realm. And they are right next to you as we speak. On the other hand, I think for those of us who are tempted to chase importance, I think this teaching here, this warning that Jesus gives, invites us to reset our mindset. Okay? Modern culture trains us to curate an image, to chase influence, to equate busyness. I work hard, that means I'm valuable, right? I make a lot of money, that makes me important. Jesus flips that script. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't. The things we chase, the things we attribute to value and identity, those don't even exist on Jesus's radar. True greatness is measured by how deeply you notice others, not by how many notice you. We might call this something like an orientation toward compassion, a preferential option for the poor. This is a life where fulfillment flows from connection, not competition. Gratitude, humility, empathy, all of these traits, modern science has linked to well-being. And so while we're out pursuing value through status and through wealth and through power in our own lives, Jesus is not only warning us against that, but he's also encouraging us to look at things a little differently. Look at things through the eyes of a child. He's not just forming theologians. He's trying to form whole humans. So I think it's important for us to take inventory. How much of our energy goes into proving ourselves? For real. Whether that's on social media, you post and then you check and see how many people have viewed it, how many people have liked it. You're always checking to see if you've got new followers, new friends on your socials. How often do we do that? But how often do we pause to really see the little ones around us? The people without a platform, the people without power. The path to peace that Jesus offers starts with a turn. That word we looked at earlier, straphete, a deliberate reorientation away from ego and toward empathy, away from platforming ourselves and toward platforming those who can never climb the steps of status in this world. When you make that turn, you discover that the kingdom of God isn't up the ladder at all. It's on the floor, at the eye level with a child. The disciples thought they were asking a question about rank, and Jesus turns it into a lesson about relationships. And I think that's still the invitation to us, to measure life not by height, but by depth, by how deeply you and I love, by how deeply you and I serve, by how deeply you and I trust that even this unseen work matters. What if the real mark of greatness is the ability to kneel? not stand above others? What if the people heaven celebrates most are the ones that earth tends to forget first? Lake Mod, go and learn. Come back for scene 18 of the JesusX30 30-day discipleship challenge.